Welcome back to Legacy of Blood, where we reveal the most chilling tales concealed within the shadows of what appear to be normal lives. Today, we explore a case that will have you questioning everything you thought you knew about family. This is the disturbing chronicle of the Follings, a married couple who took in 12 children throughout 15 years, not one of whom possessed birth certificates. What started as an inspiring tale of compassion soon descended into something much more sinister. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to Legacy of Blood and activate notifications so you won't miss our weekly journey into humanity's darkest chapters. Now, let's get started. The quiet town of Millbrook, situated among the gentle hills of western Pennsylvania, seemed an unlikely setting for a story so disturbing it would ultimately draw federal investigators. With fewer than 3,000 residents, Millbrook embodied small-town America, a place where everyone knew their neighbors, where community gatherings and Friday night football dominated social life, and where people still delivered homemade meals when illness struck. Into this picturesque environment, Howard and Margaret Folling arrived in spring 1978. The Folling home was an expansive Victorian estate on Elm Street, positioned away from the main road and partially concealed by a grove of towering oak trees. For nearly 10 years before the Follings bought it, the house had stood empty, earning the nickname, the Haunted Mansion on the Hill, among townspeople. However, Howard Folling, a prosperous investment banker from Pittsburgh, recognized promise in the deteriorating building. Together with his wife Margaret, formerly a pediatric nurse, he invested considerably in restoring the property, converting it from a decaying blight into the neighborhood's crown jewel. They appeared to be such a delightful couple, remembers Elaine Winters, who resided directly across from the Follings for almost 2 decades. Howard maintained an impeccable appearance, even for simple errands like collecting the mail. As for Margaret, she possessed this particular grace, so refined, so sophisticated. They represented the type of people you'd be eager to have at your dinner table, the kind who made you feel valued simply through conversation. Yet underneath this facade of respectability, the Follings concealed secrets that would eventually horrify the entire town. Based on public documentation, Howard and Margaret couldn't conceive biological children themselves. This reality caused Margaret profound sadness, as she'd always envisioned herself with a large family. She would observe the neighborhood kids playing from her front porch, Winters recalls. There was something deeply melancholic about it, the way she'd simply sit there for extended periods watching them laugh and chase each other around. I recall thinking then that motherhood would have suited her perfectly. Indeed, Margaret's opportunity for motherhood seemed to arrive when, during summer 1980, the Follings revealed they'd adopted an infant boy they christened James. The community celebrated with them enthusiastically. Neighbors coordinated a surprise welcoming party, and the local church conducted a special ceremony of blessing for the new family. James Folling was a lovely child, bright-eyed and quick with smiles, and the Follings showered him with obsessive attention. Margaret refused to allow anyone else to hold him, recalls Clara Jenkins, who attended the same church as the Follings. Not even during his blessing ceremony. When Pastor Williams requested to hold him for the blessing, she displayed this expression like a trapped animal. Howard needed to whisper something before she'd surrender him. And even then, she positioned herself so near to Pastor Williams that she was virtually hovering over him. Looking back, this possessive behavior might have served as the initial warning sign, though at the time it was readily dismissed as typical new mother protectiveness, particularly from someone who'd waited so long for a child. Within 2 years, the Follings had welcomed a second child, a daughter they named Elizabeth, followed quickly by Thomas, Catherine, and William. By 1985, the Follings had 5 adopted children, all younger than 6. The rapidity with which they completed these adoptions was extraordinary, especially considering Pennsylvania's typically extensive adoption procedures at that time. However, Howard Folling possessed wealth and influential connections, and the couple enjoyed an exemplary reputation in the community. They were perceived as rescuers, explains Detective Richard Cooper, who would eventually spearhead the investigation into the Follings family. Here you had this affluent couple accepting children who might otherwise have remained in the system indefinitely. Who was going to challenge that? Who would even want to? Yet there were peculiarities that, looking back, should have triggered concern. None of the Follings children enrolled in public schools. Margaret insisted on educating them at home. The children were seldom observed in town, and when they did appear, they remained constantly under their parents' watchful eyes. They didn't join sports teams or participate in other activities, and they formed no friendships beyond the family. I recall attempting to organize a playdate between my son and James Follings, says former Millbrook resident Patricia Hayes. They were roughly the same age, and James appeared so isolated. But Margaret consistently had excuses ready. James was unwell, or he had excessive homework, or they were preparing for a family vacation. Eventually, I abandoned the effort. The Follings children's isolation might have persisted indefinitely except for an incident that transpired during summer 1987. 9-year-old Thomas Follings tumbled from a tree in the family's backyard, breaking his arm. Margaret, despite her nursing background, chose not to take him to the hospital. Instead, she tried setting the bone herself, which resulted in a compound fracture that subsequently became infected. Only when Thomas developed a severely elevated fever did Howard finally override his wife and rushed the boy to emergency care. Dr. Sarah Chin served as the attending physician at Millbrook General Hospital when Thomas arrived. The child was experiencing septic shock upon arrival, Dr. Chin remembers. We needed to conduct emergency surgery to preserve his arm, and even then, substantial nerve damage occurred. What struck me most profoundly, however, was the boy's behavior. He shed no tears, not once throughout the entire experience. And when I questioned him about how he'd broken his arm, he glanced at his father before responding, as though awaiting permission to speak. Dr. Chen's concerns intensified when she requested Thomas's medical records and learned they didn't exist. According to Howard Follings, all the children's records had been destroyed in a fire at their former adoption agency. When Dr. Chen pressed for additional details, Howard grew irritated and threatened to relocate Thomas to a different hospital. That's when I understood something was wrong, Dr. Chen says. But I lacked evidence, only suspicions. And in a community like Millbrook, suspicions regarding a family like the Follings could destroy your professional reputation. Nevertheless, Dr. Chen submitted a report to Child Protective Services expressing her worries about possible medical neglect. A caseworker named David Morris received the assignment to investigate. Morris toured the Follings home, interviewed the parents, and observed the children. His report, filed 3 weeks afterward, determined there was no evidence of abuse or neglect. The children appear healthy and well-maintained, Morris documented. The home environment is sanitary and secure. Mrs. Follings clarified that she initially attempted to treat Thomas's injury herself due to her medical training and a hospital phobia stemming from her own childhood trauma. While this decision showed poor judgment, it doesn't constitute deliberate neglect. The case was dismissed, and Millbrook life resumed its normal pattern. The Follings continued growing their family, adopting 3 additional children between 1988 and 1990, Robert, Anne, and Henry. By this point, certain community members were beginning to whisper about the peculiar family on Elm Street. How could they adopt so many children so rapidly? Why were the children so rarely visible publicly? And why did they all possess the same hollow expression, as though something essential had been extracted from them? I used to observe them at church, Jenkins says. 8 children, all seated in a perfect line, not squirming, not whispering, not engaging in any typical childhood behavior during lengthy services. They simply sat motionless, staring ahead. It was unnatural. But if the community harbored questions, they largely kept them private. The Follings donated generously to local charities, and Howard served on numerous influential boards. They appeared, by all external measures, to be model citizens. Then during winter 1992, a new family relocated to Millbrook. Michael and Susan Fletcher, together with their teenage daughter Emily, settled into a modest residence just several doors from the Follings. Michael was a journalist who'd recently joined the Millbrook Gazette, and Susan was a social worker experienced in child welfare. Mom detected something troubling about the Falling kids immediately, says Emily Fletcher, now in her 40s. She had previous experience with traumatized children and recognized the indicators: the way they recoiled from sudden motions, their consistent avoidance of eye contact, the fact that they always seemed to be monitoring Margaret peripherally as though afraid of missing a signal. Susan Fletcher began documenting her observations, recording behavioral patterns that troubled her. She also attempted befriending Margaret, hoping to gain closer insight into the family dynamics. Margaret initially welcomed the connection, perhaps viewing Susan as a potential ally in a community growing increasingly curious about her unconventional family. The two women started meeting for coffee, and occasionally Susan received invitations to the Falling residence. During one of these visits, Susan noticed something peculiar, Emily says. She mentioned to me a room on the 3rd floor. The door remained perpetually locked, yet she could detect sounds emanating from within, shuffling, and occasionally weeping. When she questioned Margaret about it, Margaret claimed it was merely storage and that the house produced odd noises due to its age. But Mom remained unconvinced. Susan's concerns escalated when, in spring 1993, she glimpsed a child she didn't recognize peering from a 3rd-floor window of the Falling house. The child, a girl with lengthy dark hair, disappeared from view the instant Susan looked upward. When Susan referenced this to Margaret, Margaret dismissed it with laughter, suggesting it must have been Elizabeth or Catherine. But Susan had met all the Falling children by that time, and she felt certain this was someone new. Around this same period, Michael Fletcher was developing a series of articles about adoption fraud for the Gazette. His investigation had uncovered that multiple adoption agencies throughout Pennsylvania and surrounding states had been closed during the 1980s for illegally placing children without appropriate documentation. Dad never explicitly linked this to the Fallings in his published pieces, Emily says. But I remember him mentioning to Mom that the chronology aligned with when the Fallings were adopting their initial group of children. Whether through coincidence or deliberate timing, shortly after Michael's articles appeared in print, the Fallings announced they were adopting once more, this time, twin boys they named Peter and Paul, followed by a girl they called Mary, raising their total to 11 children. And once again, the adoptions proceeded with remarkable speed. In retrospect, it's evident they were exploiting systemic loopholes, Cooper says. They would engage with different agencies, frequently across state lines. They would supply documentation from prior adoptions to establish themselves as seasoned adoptive parents, and they would specifically request children from challenging backgrounds, children who were less likely to possess complete records, children who might slip through administrative cracks. But what was their motive? What possible reason could the Fallings have for adopting so many children? According to those who knew them most intimately, Margaret's aspiration for a large family appeared authentic. She had fashioned herself into the maternal figure she'd always envisioned becoming. Howard, though less overtly passionate about parenthood, seemed to accommodate his wife's desires without objection. It wasn't motivated by money, Cooper maintains. The Fallings already possessed considerable wealth. They had no need for adoption subsidies, which were minimal during that era anyway. And it wasn't about maintaining appearances. If anything, having such an extensive family made them conspicuous in ways they might have preferred avoiding. The truth, once it finally started emerging, proved far more disturbing than anyone could have anticipated. During fall 1994, Susan Fletcher received a breast cancer diagnosis. Her condition deteriorated rapidly, and by spring 1995 she was homebound receiving end-of-life care. During this period, as she confronted her own mortality, she decided to share her suspicions about the Follings with someone positioned to act on them. She summoned me to her bedside one evening, Cooper remembers, who was then a junior detective with the Millbrook Police Department. She had assembled this file, pages upon pages of notes she'd been maintaining on the Folling family, observations, contradictions in Margaret's various stories, photographs she'd captured of the house, including that third-floor window where she'd spotted the unknown child. She made me swear I would investigate after her passing. Susan Fletcher passed away on June 12, 1995. Cooper honored his commitment, though initially he moved with caution. The Follings wielded power in Millbrook, and accusations against them wouldn't be received lightly. Cooper commenced by examining public records associated with the family, property deeds, tax documents, and whatever limited information was accessible regarding the adoptions. Most adoption records were sealed, Cooper explains. But I managed to verify that the Follings had collaborated with at least 5 separate adoption agencies spanning 3 states. And I discovered something else intriguing. Each time they adopted, they made a substantial contribution to the involved agency. Not necessarily illegal, but definitely irregular. Cooper also uncovered that Howard Folling had established trust funds for each adopted child. On the surface, this seemed like a caring gesture, guaranteeing the children's financial security as adults. But the trust terms were bizarre. The funds would only become accessible when the child reached 25, and only if they satisfied certain conditions, including maintaining consistent contact with their adoptive parents and refraining from seeking information about their biological origins. It was about control, Cooper says. Everything the Follings did centered on control. Armed with this intelligence, Cooper decided on a more direct strategy. He began regularly driving past the Folling house, documenting who entered and exited. He interviewed neighbors, teachers who'd briefly interacted with the Folling children during mandatory standardized testing, and former household employees. The staff never remained long, Cooper notes. They'd work for the Follings for several months, perhaps a year maximum, then suddenly depart town. No advance notice, no forwarding information. It was as though they simply vanished. One former housekeeper, Maria Vasquez, had departed Millbrook in 1991 after serving the Follings for merely 6 months. Cooper located her in a small Ohio town where she was living under her maiden name. Initially, Vasquez declined to discuss her former employers. But when Cooper presented her with the file Susan Fletcher had assembled, something shifted in her expression. She began weeping, Cooper recalls. She said, "So someone else knows, someone else has witnessed." Then she started speaking, and once she began, she couldn't stop. According to Vasquez, the Folling children endured a rigid regimen designed to crush their spirits and guarantee their obedience. They were compelled to follow intricate rules that shifted constantly, making it impossible to avoid punishment. They were segregated from one another, with each child assigned an individual bedroom and prohibited from entering siblings' rooms. They were mandated to address Howard and Margaret as Sir and Madam, never as Mom and Dad. But the most horrifying thing, Cooper says, was what Maria revealed about the 3rd floor. She said there were 3 rooms up there that remained perpetually locked. She was responsible for delivering food outside these rooms 3 times daily, but she was never permitted to see who occupied them. She could hear them, though, children's voices, sometimes crying, sometimes singing softly to themselves. When she questioned Margaret about it, Margaret explained these were children with special needs who required isolation for their own protection. Vasquez had finally departed after witnessing Margaret punishing James, who was approximately 11 at the time, for speaking at dinner without first being addressed. The punishment had involved forcing the boy to remain standing in a corner throughout the entire night, with Margaret checking on him hourly to ensure he hadn't shifted position. Maria said she couldn't remain complicit anymore, Cooper says. She packed her belongings that night and left before sunrise. She felt frightened not merely of losing employment, but of what the Follings might do if they realized she disapproved. With Vasquez's testimony and Susan Fletcher's documentation, Cooper believed he possessed sufficient grounds to justify a more formal investigation. He presented his findings to his superior, Chief Raymond Wallace, anticipating support. Instead, he was instructed to abandon the matter. The chief stated there wasn't adequate evidence to warrant investigating such a respected family, Cooper recalls. He reminded me that Howard Falling maintained friendships with the mayor, the district attorney, and half the town council. He suggested I was allowing my friendship with the Fletchers to compromise my judgment. Frustrated yet determined, Cooper continued his investigation unofficially, working during personal time and maintaining his notes at home rather than the station. He remained particularly interested in identifying the children allegedly confined on the third floor, children who weren't among the 11 officially adopted by the Follings. His breakthrough arrived from an unexpected source. Emily Fletcher, then 19 and pursuing journalism studies like her father, hadn't forgotten her mother's concerns regarding the Falling family. She had been conducting her own research, focusing on missing children cases from regions where the Follings had adopted. I identified a pattern, Emily says. In at least 3 instances when the Follings adopted a child from a particular location, there was a report of another child disappearing from the same location within a month. These were invariably children from vulnerable populations, foster children, children of migrant laborers, children from families struggling with addiction or poverty, children who might not be missed immediately or whose disappearances might not generate significant attention. Emily shared her discoveries with Cooper, who utilized his law enforcement access to investigate deeper. He found that in each case Emily had identified, the missing child had never been located, and in each case, the investigation had been superficial at best. It was as though these kids didn't matter to the system, Cooper says with bitterness. As though they were expendable. Armed with this new intelligence, Cooper decided to circumvent Chief Wallace and present his case directly to the Pennsylvania State Police. He compiled a comprehensive report, including Vasquez's testimony, Susan Fletcher's documentation, Emily's research, and his own discoveries. He forwarded it to a contact at the state level, a former colleague named Lisa Harper, who now worked with a task force on crimes against children. Harper treated the report seriously. Within a week, she had obtained a warrant to search the Falling residence. But securing the warrant was merely the first obstacle. Executing that warrant would prove to be among the most challenging operations of Cooper's career. We understood we needed to move swiftly and decisively, Cooper explains. If the Fallings received any warning, they might destroy evidence or, worse, harm the children. But we also knew they had connections. If word of the impending search reached them through official channels, the entire operation could be jeopardized. Harper assembled a team of state troopers and agents from the newly established Child Exploitation and Obscenity section of the Department of Justice. Cooper was included as a local liaison. The strategy was to execute the warrant at dawn when the household would likely be asleep and most vulnerable. On the morning of October 23, 1995, a convoy of unmarked vehicles approached the Falling estate. The officers advanced quickly, securing the perimeter before announcing their presence. Howard Falling, attired in a silk bathrobe, opened the door. According to Cooper, he displayed no surprise at discovering law enforcement on his doorstep. He was anticipating us, Cooper says. Somehow he knew we were coming. He welcomed us inside as though we were guests arriving for a social engagement. He was completely composed, completely in command. Margaret Falling presented a different picture. When she grasped what was transpiring, she became hysterical, screaming that they had no authority to invade her home, that they were traumatizing her children. She required physical restraint when she assaulted one of the female officers. The house search commenced systematically, with teams designated to different areas. The 11 known falling children were discovered in their bedrooms, all awake despite the early hour, all dressed and seated on their bed edges as though awaiting inspection. They didn't respond to our presence, Harper would later report. Not with fear, not with curiosity, not with anything. It was as though they had been hollowed out. The officers attempted interviewing the children, but encountered scripted responses that revealed nothing. Even James, who was then 17 and legally capable of speaking independently, would only state, "Sir and Madam provide everything we require. We are content here." The genuine horror was uncovered on the 3rd floor. As Vasquez had testified, there were 3 locked rooms. When the officers forced open the doors, they discovered 3 children, a girl of approximately 10 and 2 boys who appeared around 8. Unlike the falling children downstairs, these children reacted with terror to strangers' presence. They huddled in corners, concealing their faces and whimpering. The conditions were appalling, Cooper says, his voice tight with anger even decades later. The rooms were barren except for mattresses on the floor. There were no toys, no books, nothing suggesting these were children's rooms. The windows were covered with blackout curtains nailed to the frames, and the smell was overwhelming. These children had been living in their own waste. Medical examinations would subsequently reveal that all 3 children were severely undernourished and displayed signs of physical abuse. None could speak English fluently, suggesting they had been taken from non-English speaking households, and none appeared in any official documentation. No birth certificates, no adoption papers, nothing indicating they legally existed. They were ghosts, Cooper says. Children who had been erased from existence. The discovery of these hidden children transformed what had been a suspected child abuse case into something far more sinister. The FBI was summoned, and the investigation expanded to include potential charges of kidnapping, human trafficking, and falsification of federal documents. Howard and Margaret Falling were arrested immediately. As they were being escorted away, Margaret broke free from the officer restraining her and rushed to the staircase, screaming something in a language none of the officers recognized. Subsequent analysis would suggest it was a form of glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, a practice associated with certain religious traditions, but also sometimes observed in individuals experiencing extreme psychological distress. That was when I first began wondering if there was a religious component to what the Follings were doing, Cooper says. Until that moment, I had assumed it was about control, about Margaret's distorted desire for a large family she could mold however she wished. But that moment on the staircase hinted at something deeper, something ritualistic. As the investigation advanced, this suspicion would be confirmed in ways that shocked even veteran law enforcement officials. With the Follings in custody, attention shifted to understanding the complete scope of their crimes and, more urgently, identifying and assisting their victims. The 3 children discovered on the 3rd floor were placed in emergency foster care, while the 11 officially adopted children were temporarily housed in a group home designed for traumatized youth. Interviewing the children proved challenging. The 11 adopted children maintained their scripted responses, refusing to deviate from what they had clearly been trained to say. The 3 hidden children, meanwhile, were too traumatized to communicate effectively. They flinched at any abrupt movement, refused eye contact, and became hysterical when separated from each other. It was as though they only trusted each other, says Dr. Evelyn Merrow, a child psychologist who worked with the children. Which made sense given what they had endured. They had been kept in isolation, their only human interaction being with each other and periodically with Margaret, who would visit them to administer what she called treatments. These treatments, as described by the children once they began communicating through art therapy, involved Margaret forcing them to consume a bitter liquid that induced drowsiness, after which she would recite what sounded like prayers or incantations over them. Sometimes she would draw symbols on their bodies with a dark liquid that might have been ink or blood. The ritual aspect was undeniable, Dr. Marrow says. But we couldn't identify any established religious tradition that matched what the children described. It seemed to be something Margaret had created herself, a personal mythology she was imposing on these vulnerable children. While Dr. Marrow worked with the children, Cooper and the federal agents searched the Falling house for evidence. In Howard's study, they discovered a concealed safe containing multiple sets of falsified adoption documents as well as large sums of cash in various currencies. But the most disturbing find was a leather-bound journal written in Margaret's hand. The journal, spanning nearly 20 years, detailed Margaret's mission to create what she called the perfect family. According to her writings, she believed children were born with sins that needed to be purged before they could become truly pure. The purging process involved severing the child's connection to their birth family, stripping away their original identity, and reshaping them according to Margaret's vision. She viewed herself as a savior, Cooper says. In her mind, she wasn't abusing these children, she was saving them. She was cleansing them of their past and granting them a new, purified existence as members of her family. The journal also revealed that Margaret classified the children into two categories, the redeemable and the vessels. The redeemable were the 11 officially adopted children whom Margaret believed could be purified through strict discipline and religious indoctrination. The vessels, the 3 children found on the 3rd floor, as well as others who had come before them, served a different purpose. According to Margaret's writings, the vessels were children whose souls were already too corrupted to be saved, Cooper explains. Instead, they were to be used as receptacles for the sins that were being purged from the redeemable children. It was a twisted form of transference. Margaret believed she could extract the evil from one child and place it into another. This explained the treatments described by the hidden children. Margaret was performing rituals designed to transfer what she perceived as sin or evil from her adopted children to these unfortunate vessels. And once a vessel was full, a state Margaret claimed to identify by looking into their eyes, they would be discarded. The journal didn't explicitly state what happened to these discarded vessels, but it did reference a resting place on the Falling property where the filled ones sleep until Judgment Day. This led to the most gruesome phase of the investigation, the search of the Falling estate's grounds. In a wooded area at the far edge of the property, cadaver dogs alerted to a patch of earth that appeared undisturbed to the human eye. Excavation revealed the remains of 5 children buried in shallow graves marked only with small stones. The medical examiner estimated that the oldest burial dated approximately 14 years prior, which would place it around 1981, shortly after the Fallings adopted James, Cooper says. The most recent was probably less than a year old. All of the children had died from similar causes, a combination of malnutrition, dehydration, and exposure. They had essentially been neglected to death. Forensic anthropologists worked to identify the remains, a process complicated by the absence of dental records or DNA samples for comparison. Eventually, 3 of the 5 children were tentatively identified as matching descriptions of children reported missing from areas where the Fallings had adopted. Maria Gomez, age 9, reported missing from a migrant worker camp in central Pennsylvania in 1981. Tyrell Washington, age 7, who disappeared from a Pittsburgh housing project in 1985. And Alexei Petrov, age 8, the son of Russian immigrants who vanished from his front yard in Philadelphia in 1990. The other 2 children remained unidentified, referred to in official records only as Jane Doe No. 1 and John Doe No. 3. That's the thing that still haunts me, Cooper says. Those 2 kids, someone must have loved them, someone must have missed them, but they died without names and were buried without ceremony. It's as if they never existed at all. As the evidence accumulated, The case against the Follings seemed irrefutable, but the legal proceedings would prove as twisted and complex as the crimes themselves. Howard Falling hired a team of high-powered defense attorneys who immediately began working to distance him from his wife's actions. They painted a picture of Howard as an unwitting participant, a man so consumed by his financial dealings that he remained oblivious to what was happening in his own home. They pointed out that Howard was frequently away on business, sometimes for weeks at a time, and that Margaret had been the primary caregiver for all the children. It was a transparent strategy, says Assistant U.S. Attorney Meredith Lane, who prosecuted the case. Howard wanted to save himself by sacrificing his wife. But the evidence didn't support his claim of ignorance. He had signed all the fraudulent adoption papers. He had established the trust funds with their controlling conditions. He had built the locked rooms on the third floor. He might not have performed the rituals, but he had enabled them at every turn. Margaret, meanwhile, was deemed incompetent to stand trial after a psychological evaluation revealed severe delusional disorder with religious preoccupation. She was committed to a secure psychiatric facility where she remained until her death in 2008. Howard, denied the opportunity to shift all blame to his wife, changed tactics. His attorneys began negotiating a plea deal, offering Howard's cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence. Specifically, they promised that Howard could provide information about other children who had been vessels, but whose remains had not been found on the property. It was a gut-wrenching decision, Lane admits. On one hand, we wanted Howard to face the harshest possible penalties for his crimes. On the other hand, the possibility of bringing closure to more families, of giving names to more lost children, that was hard to ignore. In the end, a deal was struck. Howard pleaded guilty to multiple counts of child endangerment, kidnapping, and falsification of federal documents. In exchange for his cooperation and testimony, he received a sentence of 25 years to life with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Howard's information led investigators to 3 additional burial sites, each on properties that the Follings had owned briefly before selling: a lake house in upstate New York, a hunting cabin in rural West Virginia, and a beach house on the Maryland shore. In total, the remains of 8 more children were recovered, bringing the total to 13 victims. 13 vessels for 12 redeemable children, Cooper notes. In Margaret's twisted logic, there had to be more vessels than redeemable children because some of the vessels would become filled more quickly than others. It was all part of her sick arithmetic of salvation. Of these additional 8 victims, 5 were eventually identified: Lucia Diaz, age 9, Kwame Johnson, age 7, Tran Nguyen, age 10, Sarah Blackfeather, age 8, and Dmitry Kowalski, age 6. All had been reported missing between 1983 and 1992, and all came from marginalized communities where law enforcement resources were stretched thin and missing children cases often went uninvestigated. The Follings were predators, Lane says. They deliberately targeted children who wouldn't be missed, or whose disappearances wouldn't generate headlines. They exploited the same systemic failures they used to adopt their redeemable children without proper scrutiny. As for those 12 redeemable children, their fates were varied and, in many cases, tragic. James, the oldest, committed suicide in 1998, 3 years after the Follings were arrested. Elizabeth developed severe anorexia and has been in and out of treatment facilities for most of her adult life. Thomas, whose broken arm had first brought attention to the family, disappeared after turning 18 and has never been found. Some of the younger children were eventually adopted by new families, while others remained in the foster care system until they aged out. The damage was too deep, says Dr. Merrow. These children had been systematically brainwashed from a very young age. They had been taught that their worth was tied to their purity, and that purity could only be achieved through suffering. It's not something you can undo with a few years of therapy. The three children found on the third floor, later identified as Sofia Herrera, age 10, Mateo Herrera, age 8, and Carlos Herrera, age 8, were eventually reunited with their family. They had been taken from a rural area near San Diego where their parents were migrant workers. The parents had reported their children missing, but the local police had suggested that the family had simply moved on, as migrant families often did. It was a miracle they were found alive, Cooper says. If we had waited even a few more months, well, based on Margaret's journal, Sofia was already being described as nearly filled. She would have been the next to be discarded. Howard Follings died in prison in 2011, having served 16 years of his sentence. He never expressed remorse for his actions, maintaining until the end that he had only been trying to help his wife realize her dream of a large family. His estate, valued at several $1 million, was divided among the surviving victims as part of a civil settlement. The Follings house on Elm Street was demolished in 1997, and the land was converted into a community garden dedicated to the memory of the children who had died there. Each year on the anniversary of the Follings arrest, the people of Millbrook gather in the garden for a vigil, lighting 13 lanterns for the 13 vessels and 12 candles for the 12 redeemable children whose lives were forever altered by Howard and Margaret Follings. It's not enough, Cooper says. Nothing could ever be enough to make up for what those children suffered. But it's something. It's a way of saying, we remember, we acknowledge what happened here, and we're sorry we didn't see it sooner. The case of the Follings has had lasting impacts on adoption laws and procedures in Pennsylvania and beyond. The Follings Act, passed by the Pennsylvania legislature in 1998, requires more rigorous background checks for adoptive parents, limits the number of children that can be adopted by a single family within a specific time frame, and mandates regular home visits by social workers for the first 5 years after an adoption. The system failed these children, Lane says. We all failed them, the neighbors who noticed something off but didn't speak up, the doctors who saw the signs of abuse but didn't push harder for answers, the officials who were too impressed by Howard's wealth and status to ask the hard questions. Even law enforcement, we should have taken Susan Fletcher's concerns more seriously from the beginning. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Follings case is the knowledge that there might be more victims who will never be found. Howard's cooperation was limited to the children buried on properties directly linked to the Follings. But given the family's extensive travels and Howard's business dealings across multiple states, it's possible, even likely, that there were other vessels whose remains are still undiscovered. I've made peace with the fact that we'll never know the full extent of the Follings crimes, Cooper says. But I haven't made peace with the fact that there are parents out there who still don't know what happened to their children. That's why I keep going back to the case files, even in retirement. That's why I still follow up on every lead, no matter how unlikely, because those children deserve to have their names. They deserve to have their stories told. And so the disturbing chronicle of the Follings continues to unfold, even decades after their crimes were first discovered. It serves as a reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a facade of respectability, of the vulnerable children who slip through the cracks of our society, and of the terrible consequences when those entrusted with their care betray that sacred responsibility. Before we end today's episode, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the families of the identified victims: Maria Gomez, Tyrell Washington, Alexei Petrov, Lucia Diaz, Kwame Johnson, Tran Nguyen, Sarah Blackfeather, and Dmitry Kowalski. Their lives were cut short by unimaginable cruelty, but in telling their stories, we ensure they are not forgotten. And for Jane Doe number 1, John Doe number 3, and the 3 remaining unidentified children, we may not know your names, but we bear witness to your suffering. You matter. You have always mattered. This has been Legacy of Blood. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. If you or someone you know has information about missing children, please contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-THE Lost. Sometimes, even decades later, the truth can still come to light. Until next time, stay vigilant. The darkest deeds often happen in the places we least expect. In the decades since the Follings case first shocked the nation, numerous theories have emerged about the origins of Margaret's disturbing belief system. While the official investigation focused primarily on identifying victims and building a legal case against the Follings, researchers and true crime enthusiasts have continued to probe the psychological and potentially cultural roots of Margaret's rituals. Dr. Eliza Montgomery, a professor of religious studies at the University of Pennsylvania, has spent years examining Margaret's journal and court testimonies. What's particularly interesting about Margaret's belief system is that it doesn't neatly align with any established religious tradition, Montgomery explains. It contains elements that might seem familiar: the concept of sin, the idea of purification through suffering, ritualistic cleansing, but they're combined in ways that are entirely idiosyncratic. According to Montgomery, Margaret's background might offer some clues. Born Margaret Phelps in 1945, she was raised in a small farming community in rural Minnesota. Her parents were described by neighbors as deeply religious but private people who rarely attended community events and kept their children home from school whenever possible. There were rumors in the town about unusual religious practices in the Phelps household, Montgomery says. Nothing specific, nothing that anyone could prove, but enough to make the family something of an enigma. The few people still living who remember the Phelps family described them as odd and secretive. At 18, Margaret left home to attend nursing school in Minneapolis, a move that apparently caused a permanent rift with her family. According to school records, she never returned home for holidays, and none of her family attended her graduation. By all accounts, she was a dedicated student who specialized in pediatric care, drawn to working with children from the beginning of her career. There's a gap in our understanding of Margaret's life between her graduation from nursing school in 1965 and her marriage to Howard in 1976, Montgomery notes. We know she worked at several hospitals across the Midwest, never staying in one place for more than a year or two. And we know she spent some time in Europe in the early 1970s, though the exact purpose of this trip remains unclear. It was during this European sojourn that Margaret might have encountered the obscure religious texts that later influenced her beliefs. Among her possessions seized during the investigation was a collection of manuscripts, some dating back to the 17th century, that dealt with various esoteric traditions. These included works on alchemy, Gnosticism, and certain mystical practices that involve the concept of spiritual transference, the idea that qualities like sin or virtue could be moved from one vessel to another. These weren't mainstream religious texts, Montgomery emphasizes. They were obscure, often fragmentary works that would have been difficult for a casual reader to find. Margaret must have sought them out deliberately, suggesting a pre-existing interest in these concepts. By the time Margaret met Howard Follings at a charity gala in Pittsburgh in 1975, she had developed the framework of her belief system, a system she apparently kept hidden from her husband-to-be, at least initially. Howard, by all accounts, was not a religious man. His interest was in accumulating wealth and social status, goals he pursued with single-minded determination. It's an open question whether Howard ever fully understood or shared Margaret's beliefs, says Cooper. In his testimony, he claimed he thought her interest in adoption stemmed from a genuine desire to help underprivileged children, combined with her inability to have biological children. He said he only became aware of the religious aspect gradually, and by then he was too deeply involved to extricate himself. But Cooper remained skeptical of this claim. Howard was an intelligent, observant man. The idea that he could live in that house for 15 years and not know what was happening, it stretches credulity to the breaking point. Dr. Montgomery offers another perspective. I think Howard might have seen Margaret's beliefs as a form of eccentricity, something to be humored rather than challenged. There's evidence he was genuinely in love with her, at least in the beginning. And people in love often overlook or rationalize behaviors that would alarm an outside observer. Whatever Howard's level of understanding or complicity, there's no doubt he enabled Margaret's actions through his financial resources and social connections. Without Howard's money to facilitate quick adoptions and buy properties where vessels could be hidden or buried, without his status to deflect suspicion and intimidate potential whistleblowers, Margaret's mission might have been discovered much sooner. They were a perfect storm, Cooper says grimly. Margaret with her twisted vision, Howard with his means to make it reality. And caught in the middle were 25 children whose lives were destroyed. The 25 children Cooper refers to include the 12 redeemable children who were officially adopted and subjected to years of psychological and sometimes physical abuse, and the 13 vessels who suffered even more extreme neglect before ultimately being killed when Margaret deemed them filled with the sins she believed she had extracted from her adopted children. Of the 12 adopted children, only 9 are still alive today. In addition to James's suicide and Thomas's disappearance, Catherine died of a drug overdose in 2007 at the age of 28. The surviving 9 have largely avoided public attention, changing their names and attempting to build lives away from the shadow of their traumatic childhoods. Elizabeth, now in her 40s, is the only one who has spoken publicly about her experiences. In a rare interview given to a documentary filmmaker in 2015, she described the constant fear that permeated the Follings household. "We were always afraid of disappointing them," she said. Sir and Madam, that's what we had to call them, had these elaborate rules that changed all the time. You never knew what might trigger a punishment. Something that was acceptable one day could be forbidden the next. It kept us constantly on edge, constantly vigilant. Elizabeth also spoke about the cleansing rituals Margaret performed on the children. She would make us drink this tea that tasted horrible, and then she'd make us kneel in this circle she'd drawn on the floor. She'd recite these long passages in a language none of us understood, and she'd touch our foreheads with this cold, wet finger. Sometimes she'd make cuts on our arms, small ones, nothing that would leave obvious scars, and collect the blood in a little silver cup. According to Elizabeth, the children were told these rituals were necessary to remove the badness they had brought with them from their previous lives. Madam said we were born with sin inside us, like a disease, Elizabeth recalled. She said our birth parents had infected us, and only she could cure us. If we resisted the treatments, she said the sin would grow until it consumed us, and then we'd have to go live upstairs with the bad children. The bad children, Margaret's vessels, were occasionally shown to the adopted children as a warning. She'd take us up there one at a time and make us look at them through this little window in the door, Elizabeth said. They were always so thin, so dirty. And their eyes, they looked dead already, you know. Like there was nothing inside them anymore. Madam would say, this is what happens to children who don't accept the treatment. This is what happens when the sin takes over. This psychological torture, combined with physical deprivation and isolation, created an environment of complete control. The children were entirely dependent on Margaret and Howard for everything: food, shelter, human contact, and the definition of reality itself. It was a classic cult dynamic, says Dr. Merrow. The leader defines what is true and false, good and evil. The followers are cut off from any outside influence that might contradict this definition. And over time, the followers internalize the leader's worldview to such an extent that they can no longer distinguish between their own thoughts and the thoughts that have been implanted. This explains why, even after being removed from the Follings home, many of the children continued to defend their adoptive parents and insist they had been happy there. It wasn't Stockholm Syndrome in the classical sense, Dr. Merrow clarifies. It was more fundamental than that. These children had never known any other reality. They had no framework for understanding that what had happened to them was abuse. The process of healing for these children was slow and painful. Some, like James, never managed to overcome the trauma. Others, like Elizabeth, have spent their lives in a cycle of progress and relapse, forever struggling with the psychological wounds inflicted during their formative years. The tragedy of the Falling case isn't just the 13 children who died, Dr. Marrow says. It's also the 12 who lived but were never allowed to develop into the people they might have been. Their potential was stolen from them just as surely as the lives of the vessels were stolen. In the years since the Falling case, researchers have identified similar patterns in other cases of extreme child abuse, particularly those with religious or cult-like elements. The combination of isolation, ritualistic behavior, and the exploitation of children's natural dependency creates conditions in which almost unimaginable cruelty can flourish. What makes the Falling case unique, says Montgomery, is the scale and duration of the abuse, as well as the way it was hidden in plain sight. This wasn't a compound in the wilderness or a closed religious community. This was a respected family in a typical American town. The Follings went to church on Sundays. They attended community events. Howard served on local boards. They were, to all outward appearances, pillars of the community. This facade of normalcy allowed the Follings to operate for nearly 2 decades without serious scrutiny. And when concerns were raised, by Dr. Chen after Thomas's injury, by Susan Fletcher after her observations of the family, they were too easily dismissed by those with the power to intervene. That's the lesson we should take from this case, Cooper insists. Not just the spectacular horror of what happened inside that house, but the ordinary failures that allowed it to continue. The neighbor who saw something odd but didn't want to seem nosy. The official who accepted a flimsy explanation because the alternative was too disturbing to contemplate. The colleague who noticed something wrong but didn't want to risk their career by speaking up. These everyday failures of courage and responsibility, multiplied across a community and spanning years, created the conditions in which the Follings' crimes could flourish. And according to Cooper, similar dynamics continue to enable child abuse today. The names and circumstances change, but the pattern remains the same, he says. Someone notices something wrong, but they tell themselves it's not their business. Or they report it, but they don't follow up when nothing seems to happen. Or the system gets involved, but it's too overworked and underfunded to provide the kind of sustained attention that might reveal the truth. This systemic failure is particularly pronounced when it comes to children from marginalized communities, the very children the Follings targeted as their vessels. Children from poor families, immigrant children, children of color, children in the foster care system, all are statistically more likely to be victims of abuse and less likely to receive thorough protection from that abuse. The Falling case isn't ancient history, Cooper says. It's a warning about what can happen when we fail to protect our most vulnerable children. And it's a reminder that sometimes the monster isn't hiding under the bed or in the closet. Sometimes the monster is the respected neighbor down the street, the one everyone thinks is such a pillar of the community. As for Margaret Falling, she spent the last 13 years of her life in a secure psychiatric facility, never legally tried for her crimes due to her ongoing mental incompetence. According to staff reports, she continued to perform her rituals in private, using whatever materials she could find or fashion. She maintained until her death that she had been doing God's work, saving children's souls through a sacred process of transference. In one of her final journal entries, written just months before her death from breast cancer in 2008, Margaret wrote, "They think they've stopped the mission, but they don't understand. The work continues on another plane. The vessels are filled, the redeemable are cleansed, and when judgment comes, all will see that I was right. All will know that I was chosen for this holy purpose." Howard, meanwhile, spent his years in prison writing a memoir titled Blind Trust, in which he portrayed himself as a victim of Margaret's manipulation. The manuscript was never published, as the courts ruled that Howard could not profit from his crimes. But copies have circulated among researchers and true crime enthusiasts, providing insight into the mind of a man who enabled unspeakable cruelty while maintaining his own innocence. I loved my wife, Howard wrote in the manuscript's conclusion. I believed in her goodness, her kindness, her desire to help children in need. By the time I realized the depth of her delusion, I was trapped, by my love for her, by my fear of losing everything we had built together, and by my own complicity in what had already occurred. I am not blameless, but I am not the monster they have made me out to be. I am simply a man who loved unwisely and too well. Cooper, who has read the manuscript, dismisses Howard's self-portrayal. It's self-serving nonsense, he says. Howard wasn't some love-struck victim. He was an active participant in the abuse and exploitation of 25 children. He may not have shared Margaret's religious fervor, but he was willing to benefit from it, from the adoration of a community that saw them as saviors, from the control they exerted over their victims, from the sick dynamic they created together. Regardless of Howard's motivations or level of belief, the consequences of his actions, and his failures to act, were the same. Children suffered and died. Lives were destroyed. And a community was left to grapple with the knowledge that such darkness had existed in their midst, unrecognized and unchallenged for far too long. Today, the Follings case is studied by law enforcement officers, social workers, psychologists, and religious scholars. It serves as a case study in how abuse can be hidden behind wealth and status, how destructive belief systems can develop and flourish in isolation, and how the most vulnerable members of society, children, can fall through the cracks of the systems designed to protect them. If there's any silver lining to this terrible story, Cooper says, it's that it has made us more vigilant. It has changed laws and procedures. It has made us more willing to ask difficult questions and to follow up when the answers don't seem quite right. It has reminded us that we all have a responsibility to protect children, not just the ones in our own families, but all children. And perhaps that is the legacy of the Follings case, not just a tale of horror and depravity, but a call to action. A reminder that the darkest deeds often happen in the places we least expect, and that our willingness to see, to speak, and to act can make the difference between life and death for those who cannot protect themselves. In the community garden that now stands where the Follings house once loomed, 25 trees have been planted, 12 oak trees for the redeemable children, 13 willows for the vessels. Each year they grow taller and stronger, their branches reaching toward the sky in silent testimony to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring hope that from even the darkest soil, new life can emerge. And so we end our exploration of the disturbing chronicle of the Follings, a story of horror, yes, but also a story of courage. The courage of Susan Fletcher, who first raised the alarm. The courage of Maria Vasquez, who fled the house of horrors but didn't forget what she had seen. The courage of Detective Richard Cooper, who persisted in his investigation despite official resistance. And most of all, the courage of the children who survived, Elizabeth and the others who continue to live their lives day by day, carrying burdens no child should ever have to bear. May we honor their courage with our vigilance. May we ensure that such horrors never again hide in plain sight behind respectability and wealth and the reluctance to ask uncomfortable questions. And may we never forget the names of those who didn't survive: Maria, Tyrell, Alexei, Lucia, Kwame, Tran, Sarah, Dimitri, and the 5 children whose names we may never know but whose lives mattered just the same. This has been Legacy of Blood. Until next time, remember, the most important stories are often the ones that are hardest to tell. Thank you for listening.